Hello and welcome to today's video. As I explained in our last video, over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be sharing a free course in effective financial literacy. We're going to start by looking at the main kinds of investments or asset classes, and these are shares, cash, bonds, property, and commodities. So today we begin with one of the very biggest and most important of those asset classes, shares, otherwise known as the stock market, or to use a slightly more technical term, equities. To be clear, the words share, stock, and equity all mean basically the same thing, so don't be put off by the fact that there are three different words, typical of the finance industry. A key point here is that if you want to become wealthy, it's really important to be aware of, understand, and make use of the stock market throughout your life. Sadly, far too few people do this, primarily because most people have no detailed understanding of what it actually is. Similarly, all too many people who do get involved with the stock market do so before they really understand anywhere near enough about what it is or how it actually works. And this is one of the reasons so many people lose money when they invest in shares, and when surveyed, a large percentage of the population think the stock market is a fundamentally risky thing and best avoided. This is a tragedy, and it really needn't be that way. All you need is a little knowledge. So let's get into that knowledge. Perhaps the best way for us to grasp the idea of shares or the stock market at a fundamental level is to have a quick look at how and why they came about historically. This is a good jumping off point and our focus in today's video. Along with the debt market and bonds, shares were an extremely important development in human history. It's not an exaggeration to say that without their invention, the Industrial Revolution, and the enormous technological and social developments billions of us have enjoyed in the last few centuries, which have made life so much better for so many of us, would have been impossible. This is because the invention of the stock market just enabled large groups of people to pool resources and spread risk to achieve things that one person or a small group of people could not achieve. And it's important to understand that the stock market per se is actually just a technology, and it's a technology to concentrate capital and spread risk. The idea of the joint stock company came about in the Netherlands and Britain in the early 17th century. The Dutch and the British were obviously great maritime powers who wanted to get out and about and explore the new world. The problem was that sending fleets of ships to places like America and Asia cost vast amounts of money and had very uncertain outcomes, as you might imagine. Sea voyages back then invariably took several years, and in that time there was a high risk that some or all of a fleet of ships would be lost along the way. And over time it became clear that even the aristocrats and royal families of Europe could not afford to fund these sorts of voyages of discovery by themselves. Building, equipping, and staffing ships was just far too expensive. The solution was the creation of a company and to sell shares in that company to anyone who was interested in investing. And essentially this meant that an investor who contributed, say, 1% of the costs associated with a voyage would be given a piece of paper, a share, that recorded their entitlement to a share of 1% of any profits made. If the voyage lost a minimal number of ships and came back to Amsterdam or London with valuable cargo, that shareholder could have made their fortune. If, on the other hand, as often happened, the fleet was decimated by storms or piracy, the investor might find that they had lost all of their original investment. But by sharing such enormous costs over a large number of people, this outcome wouldn't be a complete disaster for each of the individuals involved, as long as they had invested only what they could afford to lose, of course. This whole idea was nothing less than an enabling technology and actually truly revolutionary within human history. Without it, very little economic progress could have been made in the time since. Not much has changed in the last few centuries, except that you can now buy yourself shares in infinitely more things than you could when they were first invented. Today, you can own shares in a fantastic diversity of human activity from all over the world. And some of these activities, like the 17th century voyages of the Dutch and British, carry with them a high degree of risk and potential reward. Others are inherently much safer. It's also never been easier or cheaper to get involved, thanks to unceasing innovation and massive multi-billion-pound investment from the nasty old financial services industry. I think it's worth stressing just how important the invention of shares has been for our development and progress as a species. Without the stock market, there would be few large commercial buildings, no aviation or shipping industries, no automotive industry or roads, no extraordinary improvement in medicine, healthcare, and life expectancy, few, if any, of the small daily luxuries that we all take for granted, like toothpaste, toilet roll, running water, inexpensive clothing, newspapers, televisions, no film and entertainment industry, no sports stadiums, and on and on and on. Without that fundamental technology of the stock market, 80% or more of us would very likely still be subsistence farming, and life would be a hell of a lot poorer, harder, and shorter for many billions of us. And I think it's genuinely a tragedy that so few people understand this fact. I confess that when I hear multimillionaire celebrities railing against the supposed evils of stock market capitalism, I find it more than a little maddening. In my experience, such folk invariably feel this way, despite all too often even admitting that they have no understanding of what they're talking about. As a classic example of this, in his 2014 book Revolution, UK comedian Russell Brand describes stock markets as bollocks, despite admitting on the very same page of that book that he knows nothing about them. Such folk demonstrably don't understand just how much the stock market has delivered to all of us and to our species as a whole. They've never had any first-hand experience of what they're all about, and they don't know how they work, often by their own admission. They've never thought deeply about what has to happen in the forests and paper mills of Scandinavia and in the shipping and trucking industries of Europe, and about what has been spent on building a massive network of convenient retail outlets in this country just to get toilet paper into their homes, let alone the tens of thousands of other amazing products that we have today that 99% of humans who ever lived didn't have, and that so many of us take entirely for granted. Another point to make about stock markets is that they have been one of the factors which has made the world fundamentally more peaceful and less violent in the last many decades than at any other time in human history. Notwithstanding what's happening in Ukraine, Israel, and Yemen today, your risk of having to fight in a war or of dying from violence of some kind is statistically immeasurably lower today than it was for most of mankind and most of the rest of human history. The invention of capital markets is a big part of why this is the case. Global capital markets have enmeshed nation states together, with the result that the costs of war in the main now massively outweigh the benefits. And the development of the telecommunication and travel industries has meant that so many of us now have friends from countries which we previously thought of as enemies. And this is one of the many reasons why the USA will almost certainly never go to war again with Japan, and neither will Germany go to war with France, because nowadays these nations are just far too economically, politically, and socially entwined. And given all of the above, the stock market has quite demonstrably been one of the greatest inventions in human history. It's lifted billions of us out of poverty, saved us from malnutrition, and increased short lifespans. It's increased our comfort, given us more leisure time and travel, and has been largely responsible for making the world a fundamentally more peaceful, interesting, and healthy place. This is front and center simply because stock markets facilitate the sharing of risk between thousands of individuals and or organizations, and allow the concentration of a sufficient amount of capital to be focused on one extremely complex task in order to get that task done. No single individual could afford to invest enough or accumulate all the skills required to provide any of the things I've already mentioned in this video, or to create the microchip, fiber optics, the smartphone, or AI. To be clear, I'm not saying that stock market capitalism is perfect, because no system is. But I do think that all too few people understand this stuff and realize in any sufficiently emotive way just how much they've given us as a species and how far we have come as a result. Too many people are focusing on a proverbial glass that is 95% or more full and choosing to focus endlessly on the 5% that is empty, in the main because they have no first-hand experience of how financial markets work, and they've never made any concerted study of any of this stuff. And I think that's a tragedy. For what it's worth, I've just spent more than 2 years researching and writing my next book, Our Future is Biotech, which spends a great deal of time on these topics, and in particular on the role that capitalistic biotechnologies are likely to play in improving stock market capitalism and our world still further by curing things like cancer and diabetes, and by rolling back environmental degradation and improving clean power generation, for example. So rather than rail against stock markets and capitalism, a far better course of action for individuals and for our society as a whole is to take a little time to understand them and to get involved. Happily, when you buy a share in a company, you quite literally become a part owner of that company. And this means that you're then entitled to your proportional share in the company's profits. And if you think about this, this is a very exciting invention. By owning a share in a business, you can benefit from the work of everyone involved in that business, and you can start to do this with very little money. And stock market investment is not just the preserve of the wealthy, or it certainly should not be. It's available to anyone who's willing to find out about it and get involved. And it is this involvement that will give you a much better chance of becoming wealthy yourself. And so I would argue that the causality runs the opposite way to what many people think. Too many people, in fact, probably the majority of people, incorrectly think that the stock market is only for rich people, when what they should be thinking is, if I learn about and use the stock market, I have a reasonable probability of being a rich person or comfortably off at the very least. And the tragedy is that far too few people are doing this, even today, centuries after the stock market was invented. And this is why I wanted to take a few minutes in this video today to dwell on the big picture point of stock markets overall, because it's about so much more than just money. But that said, as I've shown in a previous video, the US stock market has returned some way more than 10% a year on average for more than a century, enough to make millionaires of normal people over a lifetime of investing. And the reason for this, and the reason that stock market investment works over long periods of time, is because of human progress, which has been the whole point of this video. So that's it for today. Next time, we'll go on to look in more detail at how you go about investing in them, and crucially at how to do that safely. And so, for example, we'll look at why single stock investment is very hard and probably not appropriate for most people, but why it's much easier to invest in entire markets. So for now, if you want to ensure that you're one of the first to see these future videos when they're published, and as we go through the next few steps, please do click the subscribe and bell buttons, and please do share these videos on social media if you share our belief in how important this stuff is for everyone, and certainly for our society. And until then, as ever, I wish you the very best.